The United States is massive, stretching across nearly 10 million square kilometers of highways, coastlines, and carefully managed territory. Most people assume the borders splitting these 50 states are the product of precise modern math and logical planning. They see straight lines on a map and imagine an orderly grid constructed by objective professionals. But if you look closely at the map, you will find places where the lines fail completely. You will find a teeth-shaped chunk of land biting directly into an otherwise straight border, because colonial surveyors got lost in the woods. You will find an isolated community forced to buy its running water from their historic state, rivals just to keep the toilets flushing. Make sure to stick with us until we get to our #1 spot, because it is a completely detached peninsula trapped inside a river loop where rival families fought a bloody, lawless multi-decade blood feud because state police could never arrive in time to stop the killing. Welcome to Obscure Geography, where we uncover the strange anomalies hidden right on our maps. If you have not subscribed yet, hit that button now because we post historical deep dives like this every single week. Today we are counting down 5 of the strangest state borders nobody can explain. Let's go. Number 5, Southwick, Massachusetts. The infamous Southwick Jog. Look at a map of Connecticut's northern border, and you will see a perfectly straight line shattered by a bizarre, teeth-shaped bite mark. This is a 2.5 square mile piece of Massachusetts that juts straight down into its neighbor. The anomaly cuts uniquely into the town of Granby, Connecticut, and exists purely because 17th century surveyors got lazy. The story of this border failure goes back to the colonial era, a time when stakes in the ground meant the difference between massive tax revenues and losing vast agricultural fields. Back in 1642, the Massachusetts Bay Colony hired 2 surveyors named Nathaniel Woodward and Solomon Safrey to stake out the colony's southern line. The terrain between the colonies was thick, unbroken forest, filled with difficult ravines and swamps. To save time and manual labor, the team decided to sail around Long Island Sound instead of mapping the rugged terrain overland. Their calculations were completely thrown off by ocean currents, poor tools, and a lack of direct ground reference. They mistook their starting coordinates on the Connecticut River entirely, accidentally setting the state border far too south into what should have been Connecticut territory. When subsequent overland checks were completed by Connecticut years later, they proved the line was deeply flawed. Connecticut claimed Massachusetts was stealing its land, while Massachusetts steadfastly refused to give up the thriving agricultural settlements it had already established in the zone. The neighboring towns of Enfield and Suffield actually revolted against high Massachusetts taxes in 1724, begging to join Connecticut's more liberal charter. The towns within this gray zone spent a century flip-flopping allegiances to dodge tax collectors. For generations, citizens would explicitly tell Massachusetts authorities they belonged to Connecticut when taxes were due, then swap their story when Connecticut collectors showed up. Finally, in 1804, commissioners from both states grew tired of the administrative chaos and brokered a messy compromise. Connecticut got the tax-paying border towns it wanted, while Massachusetts was awarded this small jog around Southwick as a land consolation prize to balance the books. The resulting border shape looks completely ridiculous on a map, appearing as if Massachusetts simply dropped a square block down into Connecticut's roofline. Here is the thing. The original surveyors were so widely believed to have botched the border out of sheer incompetence that a century of New England folklore claimed the team did the mapping while completely hammered on rum. Local stories persisted for 200 years that Woodward and Safrey spent more time consuming spirits at local taverns than looking through their instruments. Today, Southwick is a fully functioning town of over 9,000 residents. The jog remains firmly under Massachusetts jurisdiction, shaping local property lines and municipal jurisdictions to this day. It is just a geographic glitch left behind by 2 men who did not want to walk through the woods. Number 4, Carter Lake, Iowa. The only part of Iowa marooned in Nebraska. When Iowa and Nebraska drew their borders, they used the center of the shifting Missouri River as a natural divider. That seemed logical until April 8, 1877. The Missouri River had always been volatile, changing its speed and course depending on mountain snowmelt and heavy spring rains. On that spring night, a massive catastrophic flood forced the river to jump its banks overnight. Instead of flowing smoothly through a massive river loop called Saratoga Bend, the sheer volume of water cut directly through the narrow neck of the loop, creating a new straight channel to the east. By morning, the river had completely redirected its flow. Suddenly, a chunk of Iowa land that had been firmly attached to the eastern bank was stranded on the western Nebraska side of the water. Nebraska quickly asserted jurisdiction over this new piece of land, which was completely cut off from Iowa by the new river channel. Nebraska sent tax collectors and law enforcement to the area, which infuriated the Iowan landowners, who suddenly found themselves living under a different state's rules, without ever packing a moving box. The resulting territorial war raged for 15 years, filled with fistfights, overlapping property deeds, and jurisdictional gridlock. It escalated all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court in 1892. The Supreme Court ruled in the landmark case Nebraska v. Iowa that an avulsion, meaning a sudden catastrophic shift in a river channel, does not legally alter a state boundary line. Boundaries only shift when a river gradually erodes a bank over decades. Therefore, the border was legally locked in time along the invisible line where the old 1877 riverbed used to flow. Here is the wild part. When Nebraska tried to seize the territory, Iowa developers retaliated by weaponizing the legal loophole to open a massive, unregulated playground of speakeasies, gambling dens, and prize-fighting rings that Nebraska police were legally powerless to shut down. Because it was legally Iowa, Nebraska officers had zero jurisdiction to cross the state line, and Iowa authorities were miles away across a raging river with no bridge. Carter Lake became an oasis of vice right on Omaha's doorstep. For decades, the local operators made immense fortunes off this legal black hole. The area eventually tried to resolve its isolation by seceding from Council Bluffs, Iowa, in the 1920s to join Omaha, but Omaha refused to pay for the massive cost of extending sewer and water infrastructure across the state line. Consequently, the residents decided to form their own independent enclave. Today, Carter Lake is an active city of nearly 3,800 residents. It completely surrounds the southern and western perimeters of Omaha's bustling Epley Airfield. It features its own fully operational Iowa Municipal Services, police department, and school system. If you are an Iowa resident living here, you must cross an entire river bridge through Nebraska just to access your own home state. Waldo got the bottom of the lake, but Carter Lake got marooned on the wrong side of the river. If you are finding this video interesting, drop a thumbs up. Let us know in the comments which of these communities surprises you the most. We read every single one. We have covered some pretty strange spots so far, but we are only halfway through the list. Number 3. Lost Peninsula, Michigan. The Forgotten Finger of Michigan. The Lost Peninsula is a tiny, forgotten sliver of Michigan extending directly into the waters of Lake Erie's Maumee Bay. It is a quiet residential lakeside community of around 140 people who navigate a dual state life daily. To reach the rest of Michigan by land, residents must drive 10 minutes south directly into Lucas County, Ohio, before they can loop back into their own mainland. This anomaly is a direct casualty of the Toledo War of 1835 and 1836, an aggressive boundary dispute between the state of Ohio and the Michigan Territory. The issue arose because of a flawed piece of 18th century cartography known as the Mitchell Map. This map erroneously placed the southern tip of Lake Michigan much further north than it actually was. When Ohio wrote its state constitution, it dictated an east-west boundary line that would guarantee control over the mouth of the Maumee River, which was set to become a massive shipping port and the terminus for the Miami and Erie Canal. Michigan, using the original Northwest Ordinance line, realized that the true boundary line placed the city of Toledo inside Michigan territory. Both states deployed armed militias to the border, passed laws making it a criminal offense for citizens to obey the other state's officials, and prepared for battle. An Ohioan surveyor named Benjamin Stickney famously resisted arrest by a Michigan posse, and his son, too Stickney, stabbed a Michigan sheriff's deputy named Joseph Wood. To avoid an all-out civil conflict within the United States, Congress stepped in with a massive swap. Ohio got the valuable economic corridor known as the Toledo Strip, while Michigan was forced to accept the wild, resource-rich Upper Peninsula as a consolidation prize before it could achieve statehood. At the time, Michiganders thought they had been completely cheated, though history would prove the Upper Peninsula's copper and lumber were worth billions. However, when surveyors drew the straight boundary line across Maumee Bay to wrap up the compromise, they ran it cleanly across a tiny thumb of land jutting into the bay. They realized too late that this straight map line left the very tip of the peninsula isolated. It was technically Michigan territory, but it was physically anchored to Ohio. Here is the detail that stops people cold. Because of their extreme isolation from Michigan infrastructure, when residents turn on their taps or flush their toilets, they are entirely dependent on utility lines provided by their historic rivals in Toledo, Ohio. Michigan could not affordably run water lines under the bay to reach 140 people, so Ohio controls the utilities. The peninsula features a local marina and a popular restaurant today. The political war ended nearly 2 centuries ago, but the water off the point is still Ohio's. Number 2, Angle Inlet, Minnesota, the isolated peak of America. Angle Inlet is the sole village inside the Northwest Angle, a 123 square mile American exclave bounded by Manitoba, Ontario, and Lake of the Woods. It is the only place in the contiguous United States that sits completely north of the 49th parallel, physically severed from the rest of America. The landmass exists purely because of a monumental mistake made during the 1783 Treaty of Paris, which relied on a deeply flawed 1755 Mitchell map of the Mississippi River. When the United States and Great Britain signed the treaty to end the Revolutionary War, they intended to run the northern border straight through the Lake of the Woods to the source of the Mississippi River, which would establish a clear northwest boundary for the new nation. Unfortunately, the map makers had no idea where the Mississippi actually started, falsely believing it extended hundreds of miles further north into Canada than it did. In reality, the source of the river lay much further south, when later surveys revealed that a straight line drawn due west from the lake's northwesternmost point would completely miss the Mississippi River. Both nations were stuck with a geometric impossibility. Subsequent treaties tried to fix the error by dropping a straight line due south from that northwesternmost point down to the 49th parallel to tie the lines together. This stubbornly maintained the literal text of the original Independence Treaty, but it accidentally carved out a permanent piece of America completely cut off by land from the United States. 70% of the land in this bizarre American border thumb is now held in trust by the Ojibwe Red Lake Indian Reservation. There is no high school here. Children traveling overland to school in mainland Minnesota must pass through international borders twice every day, navigating 2 separate international checkpoints on an epic school bus ride through Manitoba. To report their entries and exits, travelers must use a designated remote automated kiosk check-in station equipped with an iPad and a telephone. You lift the receiver, tell an international border agent your passport details, and hope the system doesn't malfunction in the middle of a blizzard. Here is the single most surprising fact. Tired of being ignored by Washington and hammered by international fishing laws, the tiny community staged a theatrical mock secession in the 1990s, threatening to break away from the United States and join Canada unless their grievances were heard. They actually introduced legislation in Congress to see if they could hold a vote to leave. It was a protest, but it highlighted just how difficult it is to live inside a map error. Today, Angle Inlet is a proud, highly resilient fishing outpost of roughly 60 year-round residents. It features a post office, a tiny church, and the last remaining one-room public schoolhouse operational in Minnesota. During brutal sub-zero northern winters, the lake freezes solid, creating a literal ice highway back to the U.S. mainland. They are still there, living on an edge that a broken map created. Number 1. Kentucky Bend, the island of Kentucky trapped inside a moat of death. You are driving down a lonely 2-lane rural road through the flat, open cotton fields of northwestern Tennessee. The asphalt begins to degrade into an isolated dirt path. There are no signs, no towns, and no natural barriers, but you have just crossed an invisible state line into a place completely cut off from the state that owns it. This is the Kentucky Bend, a terrifyingly isolated 27 square mile peninsula wrapped inside an unbroken dramatic oxbow loop of the Mississippi River. It belongs to Kentucky, but it is bordered by Missouri on 3 sides and can only be reached by this single dead-end road coming up from Tennessee. The bizarre border was born from a mix of lazy colonial mapping and terrifying planetary violence. In 1665, King Charles II drew a straight line of latitude to split the colonial territories of Virginia and North Carolina. The map makers assumed the line would run cleanly across the continent, completely unaware that the Mississippi River looped north of this line, further west. When Kentucky split from Virginia and Tennessee split from North Carolina, they inherited this line. To make matters worse, the catastrophic New Madrid earthquakes of 1811 and 1812 shook the region so violently that they caused the Mississippi River to literally run backward, permanently altering the channels and sealing this loop into an inescapable geographical moat. The soil left behind by these river deposits was incredibly rich, drawing hundreds of cotton farmers to the area in the 19th century. The population swelled to over 300 people, but the geography created a structural nightmare. Here is the narrative spine that defines the Bend. The isolation of the peninsula made it completely lawless during the late 19th century. Rival families, specifically the Watson and Darnell clans, fought a multi-decade blood feud here, executing each other along the muddy riverbanks. They knew state law enforcement from Kentucky could never arrive across the river in time to stop the slaughter, and Tennessee police had no legal right to intervene. Mark Twain even chronicled the violence in life on the Mississippi, noting that generations took up the vendetta like a religion, completely forgetting what the original argument was even about. Local lore says it started over something as small as a stolen cow or a horse. The clans even attended the same small church called Compromise Landing, which straddled the state line. The families would file in silently on Sundays, the Darnells sitting on the Tennessee side, and the Watsons sitting on the Kentucky side, leaning their loaded rifles against the walls before starting their hymns. The feud finally ended in a horrific ambush when the last remaining members of the Darnell family tried to flee the peninsula on a river steamboat, only to be cut down by the Watsons along the shore. The peninsula has absolutely no stores, medical facilities, or active public services today. The very last general store closed its doors forever in the 1960s. As of the 2020 U.S. Census, the permanent population has dwindled to just 9 people, surrounded by swarming insects and the low, heavy rumble of distant river barges. Recent regional reports suggest that number may have dropped even lower, leaving the fields almost entirely to seasonal farmers and wilderness hunters. It is a silent expanse of historic earth slowly being reclaimed by the mud. A state border drawn by a king left them completely alone, and the river did the rest. These forgotten border anomalies show that the lines on our maps are rarely as clean or logical as they appear. For me, it is the Kentucky Bend, a peninsula shaped by an earthquake and left with a population of 9 people inside a river moat, is a lingering image that stays with you. Which of these state border glitches surprised you the most? If this kind of forgotten American history is what you are looking for, subscribe to our channel.